Do you know more than 80% of people measuring blood pressure incorrectly? I am Dr. Habibi, cardiologist, and in this video I am going to discuss more than 22 mistakes during measuring blood pressure. So stay with me.
The first mistake in measuring blood pressure is taking it immediately after smoking, consuming coffee, alcohol, or eating a heavy meal, which can falsely show a higher blood pressure. Therefore, there must be a 30-minute gap between consuming these substances and measuring blood pressure. The second mistake is taking the blood pressure immediately after the patient enters. The patient must sit on a chair for 5 minutes to relax and rest before we proceed to measure the blood pressure. The fourth mistake is measuring blood pressure when the patient feels the need to use the restroom. A full bladder can falsely increase blood pressure by up to 33 milliliter shots. It raises the blood pressure, so the patient must empty their bladder before measuring blood pressure. The fifth mistake is that when we are taking the blood pressure, the patient should not talk. Talking itself can raise the blood pressure. The sixth mistake is that when measuring blood pressure, the patient should not wear tight clothing. Tight clothing or a tight belt can falsely raise the blood pressure. The seventh mistake is that blood pressure should be measured on a bare arm. So we should not measure blood pressure over clothing. Now we want to compare this with the standard method on a bare arm. We will take measurement on a bare arm and again over clothing. As you can see, the systolic blood pressure over clothing was 126 millimeters, whereas when we measured it in the standard way on the bare arm, it was 108 millimeters. This shows that blood pressure should not be measured over clothing, especially if the clothing is thick. To measure blood pressure, we should not forcibly roll up the patient's sleeve, as this can cause additional pressure on the upper arm. Therefore, we should avoid doing this. Now, we will test this. I will forcibly roll up the patient's sleeve and proceed to measure the blood pressure. Well, we forcibly rolled up the patient's sleeve, which resulted in creating additional pressure. Measuring blood pressure in this way is not standard and leads to a false reading. As you can see, the patient's systolic pressure is 103 mmHg, which is about 5 mmHg lower than the pressure we measured in the standard way. The patient's diastolic blood pressure is also about 56 mmHg. Therefore, if we forcibly roll up the sleeve, it will cause both the systolic and diastolic pressures to be lower than what would be measured accurately. The ninth mistake is when the patient leans forward while taking the blood pressure. We compared these two scenarios. Once when the patient was fully leaning back against the chair with a straight back, the systolic blood pressure was 105 mmHg. The second time, the patient leaned forward. And we took the blood pressure and it was 112 mmHg. Therefore, leaning forward falsely raises the blood pressure, and we should avoid this mistaken action. The 10th mistake is that during blood pressure measurement, the patient should not cross their legs. This action leads to an increase in afterload, and consequently, the blood pressure we measure will be higher. We once had the patient in the standard position. We measured their blood pressure, which was 107 mmHg, and after the patient crossed their legs, their blood pressure became 127 mmHg. Thus, the legs should be parallel and next to each other. Bringing your legs together is the standard position for measuring blood pressure.
If you found the video helpful so far, please like it and share it with your friends. And if you don't want to miss my upcoming videos, please subscribe.
Mistake 11 is that during the first visit of the patient to us, we must definitely take the blood pressure from both the left and right hands. Because the hands have a slight difference in pressure, we took the blood pressure from the right hand and it was 107 millimeters of mercury. From the left hand, as you can see, it was 103 millimeters of mercury. Therefore, there is a difference. As long as it is less than 10 millimeters of mercury, there is no problem. But if it is more than 10 millimeters of mercury, you must consider other pathologies as well. Mistake 12 is that when taking the patient's blood pressure, they should not hold their hand in the air. Why? Because it causes the use of shoulder and arm muscles to keep it at a horizontal level, which in turn leads to a false increase in blood pressure. We measured the blood pressure in this condition, and we saw that the blood pressure was 112 millimeters of mercury, while in the standard condition, the blood pressure was 107 millimeters of mercury. Mistake 13 occurs when we want to measure blood pressure in lying down individuals, such as those hospitalized and lying in bed. To take their blood pressure, we should not raise their hand. Raising their hand leads to a falsely lower blood pressure measurement. This is why you see that we measured the blood pressure once in the standard condition. It was about 107 mmHg, and when we raised the patient's hand above their head, the systolic blood pressure became 90 immediately. Therefore, you see that the difference becomes very significant, and we cannot make an accurate judgment based on that blood pressure. Also, when measuring blood pressure in lying individuals, their hand should not be hanging down, because having the arm lower than the level of the heart leads to inaccurate blood pressure readings. The 14th mistake is not using the appropriate cuff for the sphygmomanometer when measuring blood pressure. A standard cuff, or the same type pressure cuff, is standard when it covers 80% of the arm's circumference and 40% of the arm's width. Therefore, if we use a smaller cuff, it will falsely show your blood pressure as higher, and if we use a larger cuff, it will falsely show your blood pressure as lower. We now want to test this. We want to measure the patient's blood pressure using a pediatric cuff. As you can see, this cuff is smaller than a standard cuff for an adult. We want to see what happens. So, we used a pediatric cuff, which is smaller than the normal size was, for measuring an adult's blood pressure. As we mentioned, the blood pressure measured was overestimated. That is, with a standard adult cuff, the blood pressure was 107 mmHg, whereas with the pediatric cuff, which is smaller than the normal size, it was 120 mmHg. My 15th mistake is that the placement of the blood pressure cuff might not be in the correct position. The standard position is that the blood pressure cuff should be placed 2 centimeters above the elbow crease. If we place it lower, it will give us an inaccurate reading. We need to test this important point. As you can see, we placed the blood pressure cuff once in the standard position above the elbow crease, and the pressure we obtained was 107 mmHg. However, now we have placed it on the elbow, and as you can see, it is positioned completely below the elbow. The pressure it gave us is 94 mmHg. And the place where we position the blood pressure cuff greatly affects the reading we obtain. A common mistake is when we either fasten the cuff too tightly, or too loosely. In both cases, the pressure reading we get is not accurate. The standard is that when you fasten the blood pressure cuff, only the tips of your fingers should be able to fit under it. No more and no less. Another mistake when measuring blood pressure is placing the stethoscope head under the cuff. This causes additional pressure, making the measured pressure inaccurate. We want to test this together. We place the stethoscope head under the cuff to prevent it from moving, but placing it under the cuff leads to an inaccurate blood pressure reading. As you can see, the blood pressure our systolic and diastolic readings are much lower than the actual measured values. Mistake 18 occurs when the cuff of our blood pressure has a problem and doesn't fit well. So we use our hand or finger to hold it in place. This leads to the blood pressure not being shown accurately. Mistake 19 is when we close the cuff of the blood pressure monitor and take the pressure with manual devices like mercury or aneroid sphygmomanometers. If we inflate the cuff too much or too little, inflating it too much can lead to falsely high blood pressure readings. And if it's too low, it might result in falsely low systolic blood pressure measurements. The 20th mistake occurs when we are measuring blood pressure with manual sphygmomanometers, such as aneroid or mercury devices, and we deflate the cuff too quickly. This can cause us to hear the Korotkov sounds later, leading to falsely low blood pressure recordings. The 21st mistake occurs when we use manual sphygmomanometers, such as aneroid or mercury devices, to measure blood pressure, but do not use a stethoscope. Instead, we measure the pressure based solely on the patient's pulse. This creates two problems. First, it measures the systolic blood pressure, 10 millimeters of mercury lower than the actual level. The 22nd mistake is using wrist blood pressure monitors. Wrist monitors do not show pressure as accurately as arm monitors. Therefore, whenever possible, we should use arm monitors. The 23rd mistake, which happens repeatedly, is that we do not label a patient with high blood pressure based on just one high reading. The patient's blood pressure must be repeated at least 1 or 2 more times at intervals of a few minutes. We repeat the blood pressure measurement again, and only then will we label the patient with high blood pressure. I hope that by following these principles and avoiding the mistakes I mentioned, the blood pressure readings obtained will be accurate and reliable, allowing you to prescribe the necessary medications for the patient.